I still remember the first time I saw him, just a brown lump against the cold gravel behind the diner, something small and lifeless under the flickering light of the alley. It was early morning in a quiet Montana town, the kind of silence that feels heavy before sunrise. I was finishing my shift, carrying leftover bread to the dumpster, when I heard it. A sound so faint, I almost missed it. A whimper, short and broken, like someone trying to cry through sleep. I froze. Then I saw him, a 2-month-old French Bulldog puppy, brown coat clotted with mud and grease, sides trembling with every shallow breath. He wasn't moving much, only the twitch of a paw and the weak rise of his chest. His tiny collar was too tight, digging into the skin around his neck, and there was dried food stuck to his face. I knelt down, my hands shaking as I reached toward him. The air smelled of rain and engine oil, and his body was ice cold when I touched him. For a moment, I thought he was already gone. But then he blinked, just once, slow, deliberate, as if to tell me he hadn't given up yet. I whispered, "Hey, buddy, it's okay," and felt the smallest sigh leave his body. I had seen stray dogs before, but not like this. Not this young, not this fragile. I didn't know his story yet, but in that alley, surrounded by trash and silence, I made a quiet promise. I wasn't going to leave him there. That's how it began. Just me, a broken little pup, and a morning too cold to ignore. I wrapped him in the flannel shirt I'd been wearing under my jacket, trying to share whatever warmth I had left. His body was limp, head pressed against my arm, and I could feel his heartbeat. Uneven, but stubborn. The sun was barely crawling over the rooftops of the small Montana town, painting the frost on parked cars in pale gold. Everything looked still, except for the tiny breaths against my sleeve. I hurried across the quiet street toward my truck. The door hinges creaked in the cold as I set him gently on the passenger seat, wrapped tight like something too fragile to touch. The heater groaned to life, filling the cabin with that dusty smell of old vents. For a second, I just sat there, watching his small chest rise and fall. I'd seen sick animals before, working part-time at a ranch outside town, but this one, he looked like he'd been forgotten by the world. I drove toward the only vet clinic still open early mornings, a few miles out by the grain silos. Each bump on the road made him flinch. I kept talking softly, nonsense words mostly, just to keep him tethered to the sound of a voice. "Hang on, little guy. You're doing good. Just a bit more." When the clinic came into view, I felt a knot in my throat I didn't expect. I didn't even know if they'd take him without papers, but that didn't matter anymore. I looked at the bundle in my shirt and whispered, "We're almost there." He didn't answer, but his ear twitched. It was enough. The bell above the clinic door gave a tired little ring when I pushed it open. The warmth inside hit me like a wave, thick with the smell of antiseptic and wet fur. The woman at the counter, Megan, I think her name was, looked up from her clipboard, eyes landing on the bundle in my arms. She didn't even ask questions. "Room 3, she said softly, already calling for the vet. I laid him down on the metal table, still wrapped in my shirt. When I pulled the fabric back, Megan's breath caught. The little brown French Bulldog barely stirred. His paws were raw, pads cracked and bleeding, his belly hollow and tight. His fur was matted into stiff patches of mud and oil. He let out a faint, hoarse sound, half cough, half whimper, and I had to look away for a moment to steady myself. Dr. Lyle, a gray-bearded man who'd treated half the town's animals, came in. He didn't say much either, just moved quickly, checking his gums, temperature, pulse. "Dehydrated, starved. Might be an infection too," he muttered. Then he looked up at me. "You found him out there?" I nodded. My throat felt dry. "Behind the diner. Thought he was gone." Lyle gave a slow, grim nod and hooked up a small IV line. "Well, he's not gone yet. Let's give him a chance." That sentence hit me harder than I expected. I stood there, watching the clear fluid slide through the tube and into that trembling little paw. For the first time, I felt a flicker of hope. When his eyelids fluttered halfway open, meeting mine for just a second, it felt like a quiet thank you. The first night was the longest of my life. The clinic let me stay after hours, said it was fine as long as I kept quiet. I couldn't leave him, not after seeing how small he looked under that white blanket, the IV taped to his paw like a lifeline. The room hummed with machines, and every few seconds the faint beep of his monitor reminded me he was still here, still fighting. Outside, the Montana wind scraped against the windows, rattling the glass. Inside, I sat in a plastic chair, arms folded tight, eyes fixed on the slow rise and fall of his chest. Every now and then he'd twitch in his sleep, tiny legs moving like he was trying to run from something even in his dreams. I whispered to him every time, "You're safe now. You don't have to run anymore." Megan came in around midnight to check on him, bringing me a cup of lukewarm coffee. "He's tougher than he looks," she said quietly. "Most don't fight this hard." I could only nod. My voice had given up hours ago. At some point, I dozed off in the chair, and when I woke, dawn light was spilling through the blinds. He was still breathing, softer now, steadier. The blanket had slipped halfway off, and for the first time, his fur looked less gray, more brown again. I reached out and touched his paw gently, afraid to disturb him. It was warm this time, just warm enough to make me believe he might actually make it through the morning. By the next afternoon, the little French Bulldog had opened his eyes fully. They were cloudy at first, unsure, scanning the room like he didn't trust it yet. I can't blame him. The world hadn't given him much reason to. But when he saw me, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside his crate, something in his gaze softened, just a flicker, but real. He was still weak, still hooked to the IV, but he tried to move his head toward my hand. It was the smallest gesture, tap, a fragile sign of life that broke something open inside me. I whispered, "Hey, buddy, remember me?" His ears twitched, one of them folded in that crooked puppy way. Dr. Lyle said he'd stabilized enough for small sips of water. I held the bowl gently under his chin. His tongue trembled as he tried, missing the first few laps before finally managing one. Then another. Each sip felt like a victory. The clinic smelled faintly of hay and disinfectant, and through the open window, I could hear the muffled hum of trucks from the highway. I talked to him about nothing. The weather, the old radio songs my dad used to play, even about the stubborn heater in my truck. Maybe it was pointless, but his breathing always steadied when I spoke. When Megan came in later, she smiled and said, "He's responding to your voice." I didn't know how to answer. I just looked at the tiny dog resting his head on my palm, and for the first time since I found him, I let myself imagine a future where he'd run again. Over the next few days, he began to change in small, almost invisible ways. The trembling slowed. The dullness in his eyes started to lift, replaced by something cautious, something watching. I spent every spare hour at the clinic, sitting on the cold tile floor beside his crate, whispering stories he'd never understand, but somehow seemed to listen to anyway. Megan said the antibiotics were working, that his fever had dropped. She smiled when he wagged his tail for the first time, a weak, uncertain twitch that barely moved the blanket beneath him. It shouldn't have meant so much, but it did. It felt like the first sunrise after too long in the dark. Cleaning him was the hardest part. His fur was still tangled with grime that refused to come loose, even under warm water. I remember the way he flinched when I first touched the sponge to his back, his whole body tensing. I kept my voice low. "It's just water, little guy. You're okay." The more I spoke, the stiller he became, until I could finally rinse the last of the dirt from his ears. Beneath the mud was the softest brown coat I'd ever seen, short and warm against my hand. When I finished, he looked at me, really looked, and his head tilted just slightly, like he was trying to place who I was. That small connection, that wordless recognition, was enough to undo me. That night, before leaving, I whispered, "You're gonna need a name soon." And for the first time, the silence didn't feel so heavy. The next morning, the clinic felt different, quieter, lighter somehow. The little French Bulldog was sitting up when I walked in, still shaky but holding his head high. His ears perked when he saw me, and I swear his eyes, clearer now, followed every step I took. I laughed softly, surprised by how proud I felt of him. He tried to stand when I opened the crate, legs sliding out from under him on the slick floor. I reached out, steadying him with one hand under his chest. "Easy there, champ. You're not racing yet." He gave a small grunt, frustrated but determined. I could see the stubborn spark that would probably drive me crazy later, and it made me love him even more. Megan brought in a soft towel and set it near the heater. "He's ready to start moving a bit," she said. "Short steps, no pressure." So I sat cross-legged on the floor again, a few feet away, and waited. He looked at me, then at the space between us, as if it were the longest road in the world. One step, a stumble, then another. His paws slipped once, twice, but he kept going, inch by inch until he reached me. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until his nose brushed against my knee. I laughed and felt my throat tighten. "You did it," I whispered. He pressed his small head into my leg and sighed like he'd finally found somewhere that didn't hurt. That's when I knew his name. "Miles," I said quietly, "because look how far you've come." From that day on, Miles became a regular part of my mornings. I'd show up before work, coffee in one hand and his favorite towel in the other. He'd be waiting, always awake, always watching the door like he knew the sound of my boots on the floor. The first time I saw him wag his tail before I even spoke, I couldn't help smiling. That little spark had turned into something stronger, something alive. He could stand now without help, though his back legs still trembled. The vet said short walks outside would build his strength, so I carried him to the clinic yard where the grass was damp from last night's rain. He blinked at the light, nose twitching, taking in the scent of wet earth and distant pine trees. It was the first time he'd felt real sunlight since that alley. At first, he only sat there, eyes wide, unsure of the open space. Then, suddenly, he leaned forward and took a few wobbly steps toward a patch of yellow dandelions. His paws sank slightly into the mud, but he didn't stop. He just kept going, slow, deliberate, free. I crouched nearby, watching the wind ruffle his ears, the brown fur glinting warm under the sun. It was such a simple thing, him walking through grass, but it felt like a miracle. When he stumbled and turned to look at me, I laughed and said, "It's okay, Miles. You're learning." He barked then, a short, hoarse sound that startled us both. But it was his first real voice, and it sounded like hope. Weeks passed, and the clinic no longer smelled like sickness to me. It smelled like life, like the quiet rhythm of recovery. Miles had grown heavier, stronger. His ribs no longer showed, and his coat had deepened into a soft chestnut shine. Every morning, he greeted me with that same low bark, his little tail spinning like a propeller. The difference between the shivering bundle I'd found and the bright-eyed puppy beside me now still didn't feel real. We'd started taking short walks around the outskirts of town, where old fences leaned against the wind and the mountains painted the horizon. He'd trot a few steps ahead, then glance back to make sure I was still following. Sometimes, when the sun hit just right, he'd stop completely, nose lifted to the breeze, ears twitching at every sound. I wondered what he remembered, if the world still frightened him, or if it finally felt safe. One afternoon, as we rested near a stream, he patted over and placed his paw on my boot. No sound, no bark, just that small, deliberate touch. I looked down, and his eyes met mine, calm and steady. It was as if he was saying, "I'm okay now." Back at the clinic, Megan joked that I'd been adopted, not the other way around. She wasn't wrong. The truth was I couldn't imagine leaving him behind anymore. That night, when he fell asleep on the seat beside me in the truck, snoring softly under my jacket, I realized he wasn't just surviving, he was home. The day we left the clinic felt like the end of a chapter neither of us had been sure we'd finish. The sky over the Montana hills was wide and pale blue, the kind of color that makes you believe in second chances. Miles sat in the passenger seat, a little too proud for his size, watching the world rush by through the window. His reflection in the glass was clear now. Bright eyes, smooth brown coat, a face that finally looked like it belonged to the living. We drove to the same alley where it all began. I don't know why. I just needed to see it again. The gravel was still there, the same flickering light above the diner door, but it felt smaller, emptier. Miles jumped down carefully, sniffing the ground where he'd once lain half buried in filth and fear. Then, as if to erase it all, he turned toward me, tail wagging, tongue out, waiting for the next adventure. I crouched beside him, brushing my hand over his head. "That's where you started," I whispered, "and look at you now." He barked softly, almost like he understood. As the sun dipped low, painting gold across his fur, I realized something simple but heavy. I hadn't just saved him. He'd saved something in me too. The quiet parts that had gone numb after years of loneliness, the pieces I didn't know needed rescuing. When we finally walked away, he stayed close, brushing against my leg with every step. And for the first time in a long while, the road ahead didn't feel empty. It felt alive,